From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
This is not the equivalent of the Iraq War. What this is similar to the kinds of counterterrorism campaigns that we've been engaging in consistently over the last 5, 6, 7 years.
President Obama will give a major address Wednesday night unveiling his strategy for an offensive against the Islamic State that could last as long as 3 years and beyond his administration. We'll speak with Rami Khouri, editor-at-large of the Beirut-based newspaper The Daily Star. His latest piece, Avoid a Rerun of the War on Terror. Then how do foreign powers buy influence at U.S. think tanks? A New York Times expose reveals more than a dozen prominent Washington research groups have received tens of millions of dollars from foreign governments in recent years while pushing U.S. government officials. Should they be registered as foreign lobbyists? We'll speak with Times reporter Brooke Williams. Finally, just 13 and working risky 12-hour shifts in the tobacco fields in states like North Carolina.
I was in the middle of the road, pulling the suckers out and the flowers. My head started hurting really bad, and I started seeing all black. So I got out the road and I started throwing up.
Green tobacco sickness, or nicotine poisoning. It can cause vomiting, dizziness, and irregular heart rates. We'll speak with Stephen Greenhouse, longtime labor and workplace reporter at the New York Times. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Obama's confirmed he'll not fulfill his pledge to take executive action on immigration reform by summer's end. Obama had promised a broad overhaul in the face of Republican obstruction, including a potential new reprieve to slow his record-breaking deportations. But over the weekend, the White House cited what it called House Republicans' extreme politicization of this issue for forcing President Obama to wait until after the midterm elections. Obama had faced calls from a number of Democrats to delay action so as not to hurt their election chances this November. In an interview with Chuck Todd of NBC, President Obama denied Democratic midterm success as his motivation. Instead, he said he needs more time to convince the U.S. public on the merits of his approach.
I'm being honest now about the politics of it. This problem with unaccompanied children that we saw a couple of weeks ago, where you had from Central America a surge of kids who were showing up at the border, got a lot of attention. And a lot of Americans started thinking, we've got this immigration crisis on our hands. Now, the fact of the matter is that the number of people apprehended crossing our borders has plummeted over the course of the decade. It's far lower than it was 10 years ago. And in terms of these unaccompanied children, we've actually systematically worked through the problem so that the surge in June dropped in July, dropped further in August. It's now below what it was last year. But that's not the impression on people's minds. And what I want to do is, when I take executive action, I want to make sure that it's sustainable.
Immigrant rights advocates have denounced President Obama's decision. In a statement, the group Presente said, quote, "This delay is a betrayal of the Latino community and is certainly one of the single biggest attacks on Latino families by the Democratic Party in recent memory. With news of recently deported children dying in Honduras and record-level deportations and separations of families continuing, all eyes are on the president's actions that totally devalue human Latino life." President Obama's launched an effort to rally Congress and the public behind a sustained offensive against the militant group Islamic State. Obama's set to meet with Congress on Tuesday, followed by a national address the following day. He discussed the plan with NBC's Meet the Press.
We're not looking at sending in 100,000 American troops. We are going to be, as part of an international coalition, carrying out airstrikes in support of work on the ground by Iraqi troops, Kurdish troops. We are going to be helping to put together a plan for them so that they can start retaking territory that ISIL had taken over. What I want people to understand, though, is that over the course of months, we are going to be able to not just blunt the momentum of ISIL, we are going to systematically degrade their capabilities. We're going to shrink the territory that they control. And ultimately, we're going to defeat them.
The U.S. says it'll lead the offensive against the Islamic State with a so-called core coalition of 10 countries. The White House says the fight could last beyond the end of President Obama's term in early 2017. The news follows a month of U.S. bombing attacks against Islamic State fighters in Iraq. Over the weekend, American warplanes expanded the offensive with strikes against militants near the Haditha Dam. We'll have more on the story after headlines with Rami Khouri in Beirut. The Somali militant group al-Shabaab has confirmed the killing of its leader, Ahmed Abdi Ghadani, in a U.S. drone strike last week. He had headed al-Shabaab since 2008, overseeing a number of attacks, including last year's rampage in a Kenyan shopping mall that left 67 people dead. The group has named a new leader, Sheikh Ahmad Umar Ubaida, and vowed to exact revenge for Ghadani's killing. Somalia has put its military forces on high alert for a potential attack. A ceasefire between the Ukrainian government and pro-Russian rebels appears to be holding despite a weekend of scattered attacks. A deal brokered Friday was followed by clashes around 24 hours later in Donetsk and Mariupol. The truce lays out the decentralization of power as a key component of any long-term agreement, but both Ukraine and its rival Russia have pushed diverging proposals for what that would mean. It also calls for a mass prisoner exchange. The ceasefire was reached as NATO approved a 4,000-strong force capable of rapid deployment in Eastern Europe to confront Russia. Unveiling a new report, Amnesty International's Salil Shetty accused both sides of war crimes and said satellite imagery proves Russian military involvement in Ukraine.
Russia can't deny being a party to the conflict anymore. Very systematic, well-organized mobile artillery and armored units in place. There's no way the separatist forces could have organized that themselves. On top of that, we also have eyewitness accounts of movement of Russian tanks across the border. We're getting reports of different types of violations. There's also indiscriminate shelling which is happening, and all of these need to be investigated, and that's what we're calling on, because in a war situation, in a conflict situation, unless you go into the details, you can't be absolutely certain. But from everything we've seen, we can be quite sure that both sides can be accused of war crimes at this point.
The UN says over 3,000 people have died in eastern Ukraine since violence broke out in April, including the 298 passengers killed when a Malaysia Airlines flight was shot down. The African Union's holding an emergency meeting on the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. More than 2,000 people have been killed, and the UN has warned the toll could hit 20,000 before the virus is contained. Hopes were slightly raised over the weekend as a new study found an experimental vaccine gave full protection to monkeys for at least 5 weeks to up to 10 months. It's the first time a vaccine program has led to sustained Ebola immunity. U.S. researchers have now begun human trials. On Friday, World Health Organization Assistant Director General Mariupol Kini said 2 experimental vaccines could be available for health workers by November.
We will have results of safety by November 2014, and after that, these vaccines will start to be rolled out in the affected country, starting with healthcare workers and other frontline staff in the affected country. So this is real. This is going into the field. This is not staying it in laboratories.
The UN has now set a goal of containing the epidemic within 6 to 9 months. Speaking to NBC's Meet the Press, President Obama said the U.S. military will play a role in the international response.
We're going to have to get U.S. military assets just to set up, for example, isolation units and equipment there to provide security for public health workers surging from around the world. If we do that, then it's still going to be months before this problem is controllable in Africa, but it shouldn't reach our shores. If we don't make that effort now, and this spreads not just through Africa, but other parts of the world, there's the prospect then that the virus mutates, it becomes more easily transmittable, and then it could be a serious danger to the United States.
A pair of newly released documents reveal more details about the Bush administration's legal rationale for the warrantless wiretapping of U.S. citizens after the 9/11 attacks. The documents relate to sweeping surveillance conducted by the National Security Agency under the program known as Stellar Wind. In a decade-old memo obtained by the Washington Post, Jack Goldsmith, who led President George W. Bush's Office of Legal Counsel, says the 9/11 attacks justify what he calls the president's, quote, inherent constitutional authority to order warrantless wiretapping, an authority, quote, that Congress cannot curtail. Patrick Toomey, an attorney for the ACLU, told the Washington Post the memo's conclusions, quote, suggest the president's power to monitor the communications of Americans is virtually unlimited when it comes to foreign intelligence, he said. Toomey also said while the Obama administration's legal rationales may have shifted, quote, some of today's surveillance programs are even broader and more intrusive than those put in place more than a decade ago by President Bush. The majority owner of the National Basketball Association's Atlanta Hawks is selling his stake over the disclosure of a racially charged email. In August 2012, Bruce Levinson wrote his co-owners and general manager to ask that more be done in order to attract Southern whites uncomfortable around African-American spectators. Citing the playing of hip-hop music in a cheerleading squad that's majority black, Levinson said, quote, my theory is that the black crowd scared away the whites and there are simply not enough affluent black fans to build a significant season ticket base. I never felt uncomfortable, but I think Southern whites simply were not comfortable being in an arena or at a bar where they were in the minority. Levinson calls that attitude, quote, racist garbage, but concludes that it should still be catered to in order to boost ticket sales. Levinson has now apologized for what he says was inflammatory nonsense on his part. It's the second time in months an NBA owner has sold his controlling interests over racist remarks following Donald Sterling of the Los Angeles Clippers. And a federal judge has approved New York City's $41 million settlement with the Central Park Five, wrongfully convicted of raping a female jogger in Central Park 25 years ago. The 5 black and Latino men were tried as teenagers. Media coverage at the time portrayed them as guilty and used racially coded terms to describe them. But their convictions were vacated in 2002 when the real rapist came forward and confessed after the 5 had already served jail terms of up to 13 years. Each man of the 5 will receive around $1 million for each year they were wrongfully imprisoned. The agreement is one of several civil rights settlements under New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio after fierce opposition from his predecessor, Michael Bloomberg. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Obama has begun to unveil a strategy for an offensive against the Islamic State that could last as long as 3 years and beyond the end of his administration. This comes as the United States has carried out more than 140 airstrikes against ISIS fighters in Iraq in the past month. Over the weekend, American warplanes launched fresh strikes against militants near Haditha Dam, less than 150 miles northwest of the capital, Baghdad. On Tuesday, Obama is set to meet with Congress to discuss the new strategy. On Wednesday, scheduled to give a major address to give more details to the American public. He first outlined the plan Sunday on Meet the Press. Obama says he has ruled out the redeployment of ground troops in Iraq, but has left open the possibility of airstrikes in Syria, as well as economic and political measures. At the NATO summit Friday, Secretary of State John Kerry and Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel said the U.S. will lead the offensive against the Islamic State with a so-called core coalition of 10 countries. The group includes Britain, France, Germany, Canada, Australia, Italy, Poland, Denmark, and Turkey, the only Muslim state. On Sunday, Arab League foreign ministers met in Cairo and announced they would cooperate with efforts to combat militants who've overrun parts of Iraq and Syria. The resolution did not explicitly support the U.S. campaign against the Islamic State, but suggested it would back the effort. This is Arab League Secretary General Nabil al-Arabi.
This matter is neither political nor security related only, but we will discuss it from all directions to block it and stop its sources. This requires cooperation between different ministers and preemptive meetings and researching the subject from all its angles. However, the combat still stands, and the confrontation. It is not a simple decision. The decision to confront these phenomena, as many states demand. Also, by working on blocking the sources of terrorism, through fighting its ideology, seizing its funding, remedying reasons and circumstances that led to the outbreak of this extremist terrorist phenomena.
All of this comes as a new report by a private British firm that monitors arms trafficking says military equipment provided by the United States and Saudi Arabia has fallen into the hands of Islamic State fighters. The firm examined rockets and small arms stamped property of the U.S. government that appear to have been supplied to Shiite forces in Iraq during the U.S. occupation. Well, for more, we're going to Beirut, Lebanon, to Rami Khouri, the director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. He's also editor-at-large of the Beirut-based newspaper, The Daily Star. His latest piece, Avoid a Rerun of the War on Terror. He's joining us by Democracy Now! Video stream in Beirut. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Rami Khouri. What President Obama has said so far this weekend about the strategy in dealing with the Islamic State, as well as the, well, more than 100 strikes in Iraq. Can you respond?
Well, it's pretty impressive how we can go from no strategy to 60 miles an hour in like 5 days. But I think we have to basically understand that the United States feels it must do something. It's not quite sure what is the best thing to do. And Obama is being cautious, understandably, because the United States has just come out of two rather catastrophic military adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq, and a third, I would call it catastrophic adventure with drone assassinations all over the world. With absolutely no accountability, total impunity, and the cruel and hard irony is that in the last, say, 15 or 20 years of the United States using military action to try to strike al-Qaeda and the derivative groups that have come out of al-Qaeda, the irony is that this has been the single greatest promoter, mobilizer of new recruits for these kinds of militant Islamic terror groups. So the more the U.S. leads military action, the greater becomes the expanse of recruits and the territory that is controlled by these groups. So it's a real dilemma for the United States, and it's something that has to be fundamentally led by people in the region, and that's not happening very well. So there's no easy answer.
Explain how that recruiting works, Rami Khouri.
Well, if you go back to the beginning of this phase of the Salafist Qaeda, jihadi type movements, there's many different names for them, Firi, but let's call them, militant Islamists like Al-Qaeda. They started basically to fight the Russians in Afghanistan in the late 70s, early 80s, and the U.S. helped them with money and training and things like that. And then in the mid-80s and then into the 90s, the group under bin Laden's leadership in Sudan and other places shifted to try to hit the United States. They thought the far enemy, the U.S. they called the far enemy, was the one that had to be hit because it was the U.S. that was supporting all these dictators in the Arab world, and therefore better to hit the far enemy. And then after the U.S. came into the Middle East in the Iraq war to liberate Kuwait, and then the U.S. stayed with troops in Saudi Arabia, then the United States became the main enemy because, again, like the Russians in Afghanistan, it was a foreign army in Arab or Islamic lands, and therefore it had to be driven out. So military action by foreign powers, whether they're Americans or Russian, it doesn't matter, military action in Arab Islamic lands by foreign powers has been the most consistent and most effective recruiting tool to attract new recruits to these kinds of movements like Al-Qaeda, like Jabhat al-Nusra, like the Islamic State and others like them, because these guys project themselves and see themselves as fighting what they call a defensive jihad. They're trying to protect and cleanse Islamic societies from the two great problems they feel it faces. One is corrupt, amoral, un-Islamic regimes, and the other is foreign military threats and attacks. So again, the U.S. using military action is going to increase the problem in the long run. You can see the track record going back to the mid-'80s when Clinton was attacking bin Laden's bases in Africa and other places, Sudan. And over the last 15 or 20 years, the more that the U.S. has used military power to attack and degrade al-Qaeda, the bigger that al-Qaeda has become. And if you look at these movements that have been spawned by it or imitated, they now have anchorage, small anchorage, but they have anchorage in Somalia, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, in Nigeria, in Mali, in Libya, Pakistan, Afghanistan, probably some other places too. Now these groups, I should say, don't have support in these societies. They don't willingly attract millions and millions of supporters. They've been rejected by the vast majority of Arabs and Muslims, and they can only operate with this chaos. And American militarism brings chaos in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in other places. So this is why I'm so concerned about a rerun of George W. Bush's really successful and I would say quite criminal war on terror.
This is President Obama speaking Sunday on Meet the Press.
We're not looking at sending in 100,000 American troops. We are going to be, as part of an international coalition, carrying out airstrikes in support of work on the ground by Iraqi troops, Kurdish troops. We are going to be helping to put together a plan for them so that they can start retaking territory that ISIL had taken over. What I want people to understand, though, is that over the course of months, we are going to be able to not just blunt the momentum of ISIL, we are going to systematically degrade their capabilities. We're going to shrink the territory that they control. And ultimately, we're going to defeat them.
That's President Obama on Sunday. Can you talk about the other states that are joining in, Rami Khouri, and particularly Arab countries, where they fit into this picture?
Well, the problem with the Arab countries is that most of them are responsible for the inadvertent but clear birth and expansion of these kind of Salafi, jihadi, extremist, militant Islamist groups. If you go back to the 70s and 80s, where these groups really started to take shape, the incubator for al-Qaeda and other groups like it were Saudi jails, Egyptian jails, Jordanian jails, Iraqi jails, Syrian jails, Tunisian jails. The jails of Arab regimes is where these movements were born. Young men became radicalized, then they got out of jail, and then they became jihadis. They went to Afghanistan, bin Laden organized them, the CIA helped them, and then off they go. It was the American military presence in the region that created the conditions, in fact, that allowed Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian, to come in and start an al-Qaeda offshoot there, and then that expanded. So the problem is that all these Arab countries are in the same dilemma that the U.S. is in, which is their autocracy, their mistreatment of their citizens created this problem over the years. And American militarism, from the American perspective, is also part of the impetus that expands this problem. So combining American militarism with Arab dictatorships is probably the stupidest recipe that anybody could possibly come up with to try to fight jihadi movements like al-Qaeda and Islamic State and others, because it was that combination of Arab autocracy and American militarism that actually nurtured and let these movements expand. There has to be a more intelligent, more realistic process that allows the people in the Middle East to roll back these threats. And these people need to be fought. I'm not saying you sit around and do nothing. You have to fight these people and eradicate them because they're really awful. And then the people in the region are the ones who suffer more than anybody else.
Rami Khouri, Rami Khoury, one of the ways that has focused U.S. attention, of course, is the killing of the U.S. journalists, the beheading of the U.S. journalists. The Independent had a very interesting piece, Who Beheads More People, ISIS or the government of Saudi Arabia? And they said that in the 21 months between James Foley's capture in 2012 and a subsequent beheading by ISIS militants in August 19, 2014, Saudi Arabia beheaded 113 people. It says this did not include any estimates for executions at the end of 2012. Most of the beheadings are carried out as public executions at the notorious Chop Square in Riyadh for crimes such as blasphemy, drug smuggling, sedition, and sorcery. Although for certain crimes such as adultery, the authorities may order death by stoning. Rami Khoury.
Well, this is a very old, 18th century Wahhabi brand of hardline Islamic justice, really severe, that the overwhelming majority of Muslims all over the world think is something that should have been left behind in the 18th century. There's very few people, almost nobody around the world, except the Saudis and these Islamic State guys and Qaeda people, even Qaeda has stopped doing it, that do this. So I wouldn't focus particularly on that. I mean, there's been many more people that have been killed by American drones who are innocent than people who have been killed by Saudis. And the Saudis have this justice system. It's a system. We may not like it. They probably don't like people being put in the electric chair in Texas every couple of months. So there's a qualitative difference between what we're talking about. I would certainly disagree with the way the Saudis chop people's heads off as a form of justice and deterrence, because it doesn't work any more than electric chairs work in the United States.
And of course, there's the journalists wearing the orange jumpsuits, reminiscent of Guantanamo.
There's what? Oh yes, of course. So what the Islamic State guys are doing are kind of poking Obama in the ribs and saying, look, you kill us, we kill you. You make us dress in orange jumpsuits. We're going to do the same thing to your people. Of course, the innocent journalists should not be captured or killed, and they certainly shouldn't be put in jails as they are in Egypt, which is the great friend of the United States. So there's many parallels between these things. Each one of them is different. It's hard to we shouldn't compare the United States with Saudi Arabia with Islamic State stuff. They're all very different, but there is a common thread that runs through them, which is that the use of military power and extreme acts of torture or assassinations almost always backfire. You cannot try to have an orderly, just, decent society while relying heavily on militarism and death as a form of deterrence. So, but the problem before us all is, what do we do about this Islamic State? These guys are taking more territory. They're enforcing their rule by force, by terrorizing people, and very few people are happily accepting them. They don't, ordinary people don't have a choice. If the Islamic State comes in with their guns and chops people's heads off or crucifies a couple of people, everybody else stays. And this should be a telltale sign that these groups only can operate in zones of chaos. And the United States and others, the British, have helped create these zones of chaos in the last 20 years in Afghanistan and in Iraq most recently. So there's really a lot of shared responsibility for this terrible situation we're in. But the bottom line is we need to figure out how to fight the two real problems, which Obama keeps repeating as his strategy, the two real problems of autocratic, non-democratic, abusive, corrupt, pretty inefficient, mediocre Arab government systems, Arab regimes across the board. And the other one is the repeated use of American, British, Israeli, other military power in the region to try to enforce an order that the West and the Israelis and others feel is suitable for them. Those two problems are two of the root causes of all of these issues that we're seeing, and the Islamic State is simply a symptom of years and years of this of these kinds of problems of bad governance.
Rami Khouri, we want to thank you for being with us, director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, also editor-at-large of the Beirut-based newspaper, The Daily Star. We'll link to your latest piece, Avoid a Rerun of the War on Terror. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. Music by Mohammed Saleh and Haitham Hassa. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to a New York Times expose, which finds some of the most influential think tanks in the United States are awash in funds from foreign governments. According to the investigation published over the weekend, quote, more than a dozen prominent Washington research groups have received tens of millions of dollars from foreign governments in recent years while pushing United States government officials to adopt policies that often reflect the donors' priorities. The story is headlined, Foreign Powers Buy Influence at Think Tanks. It reveals most of the money comes from countries in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, including the oil-producing nations of the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Norway. Some scholars funded by the think tanks say they face pressure to reach conclusions friendly to the government financing the research. Among the organizations named in the report are the Brookings Institution, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Atlantic Council. For more, we're joined by one of the article's authors, Brooke Williams, contributing reporter at the New York Times, who co-wrote the piece. She's also an investigative journalism fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. Brooke Williams, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what you found.
Thank you for having me. Well, we found tens of millions of dollars, as much as 92 million, and that's a bare minimum, from foreign governments and foreign-controlled entities to think tanks, mostly in Washington, D.C. We also found a window to examine how the think tanks are interacting with the governments. And this is something that we've done for the first time. Think tanks have always, some of them have always published lists of donors. However, we could never tell what the foreign governments were paying for exactly, and usually not how much money they provided. However, we used public records from one of the governments and provided a window into how the think tanks were interacting. And what we found were some agreements in which the foreign government, Norway in particular, was explicitly asking a think tank to approach,
think tank being?
The Center for Global Development, and to approach U.S. policymakers with a specific objective that was in the government's interest. And we found that donors—
What were they asking for?
They were asking for to double spending in a foreign aid program. And a progress report that they sent to the Norwegian government said target U.S. policymakers, and then listed the policymakers that they would be targeting.
And the foreign aid money would go to where?
the foreign aid money, it was doubling U.S. spending money it's a deforestation effort. So it's a climate change agenda.
Mm-hmm. And talk about other examples that you found.
We found letters, for instance, from think tanks such as the Atlantic Council, and they're on the document viewer that's on readers can see on the website.
You built the database.
I built the database,
Mm-hmm.
and so yes, and this is the first of its kind in which we can really track how much money. I mean, it's coming from all over the world, but as you mentioned, certain areas are more heavily involved. But we found letters, for instance, from the Atlantic Council to a Norwegian energy minister, inviting them to attend an event and saying to the state-owned oil company, if you attend, this will really benefit your interests. We found in one case a Brookings scholar saying that he would help to bring along a State Department official to a meeting, and Norway is a major donor to Brookings.
Let me bring in Brookings' response, who we called. This is a message published by Strobe Talbot, president of the Brookings Institution, in response to the New York Times article on foreign powers buying influence at think tanks. Talbot writes, quote, "By disregarding important facts and taking information out of context, the reporters drew inaccurate conclusions that misrepresent the work of Brookings and ignore the institutional safeguards we have in place to ensure complete independence for our scholars' research and policy recommendations." Your response to that, Brooke Williams?
So Brookings does have institutional safeguards, and we examined them and we included them in the article. I think it's important to remember, however, that even with explicit rules, there can be implicit understandings. And as you can see in the article, we spoke with scholars who said donations from foreign governments led to implicit agreements, that they would refrain from criticizing the donor governments. So even with explicit agreements, there can be implicit agreements and pressure to self-censor.
You talked about the Atlantic Council, and you feature a photograph in addition to in the text of Michelle Dunn, who resigned as head of the Atlantic Council Center for the Middle East after calling for suspension of military aid to Egypt in 2013. Explain what happened and what this has to do with your central point in this article.
Well, it comes back to the idea that scholars rely on funding from donors. And, Brookings, for instance, said their senior scholars, they have an understanding and agreement that senior scholars, even if a donor pulls funding, will not lose their jobs because of that, right? And so this goes back to safeguards in place at institutions. In that case, the Atlantic Council declined to comment much on what happened there, but I think it comes back to the idea of feeling pressure to self-censor and what might happen if a scholar were to criticize a donor government.
Talk about the laws in the United States, not just the rules of these different organizations, around the issue of registering as a lobbyist.
Right. Yeah. So the law pertaining to foreign government interests is much more strict than the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which we know companies registered to lobby. So it requires foreign government interests who are attempting to influence public opinion or policy to register as foreign agents under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And those filings are extremely detailed. They contained the dates and contacts of reporters, think tank officials, you name it. They listed the dates of contact, the purpose, whether it was by phone or in a person meeting. And it goes back to World War II in an effort for the U.S. government to distinguish between Nazi Germany propaganda and research. And So this.
Do you think these think tanks should have to register as foreign agents?
Well, what I can say is that we spoke with attorneys who specialize in this area and examined several times the documents that we obtained, the agreements between the think tanks and the foreign governments. And the language in the documents, in these agreements, those attorneys felt was strong enough. They leaned back in their chairs and said, wow, this is explicit. Some of the documents explicitly showed how the government was asking the think tank to influence public policy and, in some cases, opinion.
You have a piece under the subheadline, Parallels with Lobbying. The line between scholarly research and lobbying can sometimes be hard to discern. Last year, Japan began an effort to persuade American officials to accelerate negotiations over a free trade agreement known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, one of Japan's top priorities. The country already had lobbyists on retainer from the Washington firm Aiken Gump, but decided to embark on a broader campaign. Aiken Gump lobbyists approached several influential members of Congress and their staffs. In October, the lawmakers established just such a group, the Friends of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in October of 2013. Talk about what happened from there.
So they established this group, and there's an organization called the Japan External Trade Organization. We found in filings with the Department of Justice that they had been paying the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as other think tanks, for research and consulting. And then we also documented that the product of these seminars and groups that they held was to promote the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, a scholar there, ended up testifying before Congress promoting the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what this comes down to is, do lawmakers know when someone from a research organization approaches them with a policy recommendation? Do they know that a foreign government has funded that organization, or in some cases, even the policy paper itself?
And explain the Center for Strategic and International Studies relationship with this?
Well, the Center for Strategic and International Studies has a seminar. It's called the JETRO CSIS Seminar. Annually, they bring together lawmakers, specifically lawmakers who are in charge of U.S. trade policy, and Japan officials who are in charge of Japan's trade policy, together, funded by the Japanese government and this Japan Trade Organization, to discuss U.S. policies in trade. And those policies are very important to Japan. So attorneys who looked at these documents, that area was more gray than perhaps the Center for Global Development and Brookings, but it still produced questions. Was this lobbying? Bringing together, it was providing access at the very least.
Did you find violations of U.S. law?
The attorneys we spoke with thought that the documents they reviewed, that I requested and obtained from Norway, the attorneys we interviewed believed that two of the think tanks have.
Can you name those two think tanks?
Brookings and the Center for Global Development.
And so where would that lead?
Well, it's hard to say. The Department of Justice is in charge of the Foreign Agent Registration Act and in charge of enforcing it. And we'll have to see what happens from here.
Well, we'll leave it at that. I want to thank you very much for being with us. Brooke Williams is one of the journalists who wrote the New York Times piece, Foreign Powers by Influence at Think Tanks. She is also an investigative journalism fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, and built the database that you can see. We'll link to the New York Times piece that links to that database. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. 13 years old and working in the tobacco plantations in North Carolina and other states. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Tobacco companies cannot legally sell cigarettes to children, but they're reportedly profiting from child labor. That's the conclusion of a recent investigation by the New York Times that uncovers the dangers faced by thousands of children working on tobacco farms in the United States. Headline, Just 13 and Working Risky 12-Hour Shifts in the Tobacco Fields. The piece reveals child laborers frequently catch what is known as green tobacco sickness, or nicotine poisoning, which can cause vomiting, dizziness, irregular heart rates, among other symptoms. Children are especially vulnerable to toxic pesticides since their bodies are still developing. The risks include nervous system damage, reproductive impacts, and cancer. Many of the kids are immigrants or children of immigrants and routinely work 60-hour work weeks without overtime pay. Tobacco workers can absorb as much nicotine as if they were actually smoking simply by handling wet tobacco leaves. Earlier this year, Human Rights Watch spoke to several child tobacco workers who describe what it's like to work on tobacco farms.
Your neck starts hurting, your shoulders are hurting, and you're just like your body wants to give up.
It feels like you can't feel your legs and you gotta take breaks.
I use the bathroom before I leave, and I just wait till I get back here. We start working at 6 and we get out at 6, and I just wait till I get home.
It feels horrible because you feel like there's no air, and then you look down, you look beside, and then you're only halfway done, and you feel like it's time for us to get out because you feel like you're going to die in there.
That's a clip from a video by Human Rights Watch, which accompanied its recent report, U.S. Child Workers in Danger on Tobacco Farms. Under U.S. law, tobacco farms can hire workers at much younger ages for longer hours and under more hazardous conditions than in almost any other sector. Federal law allows children as young as 12 years old to work on farms for unlimited hours as long as it doesn't conflict with their school attendance. Tobacco growers say the practice of using young teenagers is rare, but the New York Times found the practice is still prevalent. Well, for more, we're joined by Stephen Greenhouse, the longtime labor and workplace reporter for the New York Times, author of the expose, Just 13 and Working Risky 12-Hour Shifts in the Tobacco Field. Stephen Greenhouse, welcome back to Democracy Now! Explain more what you found.
So I went to North Carolina, and I went to the eastern part of the state and visited many tobacco farms and met many young kids who were working in tobacco. 13-year-old Saray Cambre Alvarez, 16-year-old Ana Flores, 15-year-old Edison Buenos, and it is fairly prevalent. And I was shocked that a lot of these kids said, I work on the fields from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Ana Flores told me she wakes up at 5 in the morning, leaves for the fields at 6, gets to the fields at 7, works until 7 p.m., sometimes 8 p.m., sometimes 8:30. And a lot of these kids told me they get really sick some of the time. The nicotine, when there's a lot of dew, when it rains, the nicotine in the plants will kind of dissolve into the water, and when it gets on people's skin, that's when they get this nicotine poisoning, green tobacco sickness, and they throw up, they get nauseous, they get dizzy. This one 15-year-old girl, Esmeralda Juarez, told me that at one point she was feeling so sick she asked her supervisor, "I really need just to sit for 5 or 10 minutes. I'm feeling nauseous," and she told me that unless she kept on working, he was going to fire her. So it's a very difficult, shall I say, road to hoe. It's very difficult for these kids. It's very difficult for many workers. Even
getting access to water.
Even so, a lot of the workers say the days are too long. It's very, very hot. When North Carolina in the summer it can be 90, 95, even 100. And some of the workers I interviewed said that they'll work across the field. They'll be dying of thirst, but it might take another hour for them to, weed or pluck unwanted flowers off the plants, and to take them an hour to get back to the trucks where the water were. And they say they felt extremely thirsty, extremely uncomfortable.
Human Rights Watch found many child tobacco workers are expected to operate dangerous machinery, lift heavy loads, climb to perilous heights to hang tobacco for drying. One boy who preferred not to be named described the dangers he faces on the job.
Almost all of us climb up onto the wooden beams. They're 10, 15, 20, 30 meters high. Sometimes you can step into the wrong place and fall all the way down. If you suffer an accident, you can even lose your life. It's very dangerous.
I mean, Stephen Greenhouse, this is dangerous for adults, let alone children. You write, opponents of child labor note Brazil, India, and some other tobacco-producing nations already prohibit anyone under 18 from working on tobacco farms. What happened here?
So 3 years ago, then Secretary of Labor Hilda Solis proposed some broad new restrictions against child labor. She proposed that no children under 16 work in tobacco fields, and as part of that package, she said no children under 16 should work with power-driven equipment like tractors. She also proposed that no children under 18 work in grain silos. There were some horrendous stories about kids being crushed to death in grain silos. Then, as often happens in the United States, there was a huge backlash by industry, by farmers saying, "This is terrible. We need these workers. It's important to have young workers learning agriculture, and if you ban them, it's going to really hurt the next generation of people in farming." And the Obama administration, this was now in 2012 during his re-election campaign, and basically the Obama administration caved and withdrew Secretary Solis's proposal. So now what's happening, Amy, is some advocates are trying to kind of refloat this idea just with regard to tobacco, thinking that in President Obama's last 2 years of office, with all these elections and politics behind him, he might have the courage to go forward with this ban on tobacco workers under age 16.
Let me read the Obama administration comment statement, the press release that it issued. The Obama administration issued a press statement that read, the Obama administration is firmly committed to promoting family farmers and respecting the rural way of life, especially the role that parents and other family members play in passing those traditions down through the generations. Your response, Stephen Greenhouse.
I should have explained, Amy. So after Secretary Solis proposed this, all these farmers said, we run family farms. We need our 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 14-year-olds able to work on the farms. And the Obama administration has explicitly exempted family farms and kids on those, and children on those farms from these rules. Nonetheless, there was such a firestorm against these proposals, not just by agricultural interests, but by many Republican lawmakers, and then some Democratic lawmakers in the farm states also got very worried that it might hurt their reelection, and President Obama thought it might cause him to lose certain states. So he basically, I used the word caved, and he said, we're not going to really consider these proposals for the remainder of my administration, which is pretty strong language, but Human Rights Watch and other groups are really pushing now, saying tobacco work is so unhealthy for kids. Let's make this one exception and bar this in your last 2 years of office.
Let's turn to Graham Boyd, the Executive Vice President for the Tobacco Growers Association of North Carolina. He told you most tobacco farmers go beyond what is required in terms of labor compliance, saying there's absolutely zero benefit in mistreating farm workers. He went on to acknowledge the danger of nicotine poisoning and other tough conditions in the field, saying, quote, "No one's going to say it's a day at the beach." Stephen Green.
Yes. So, I was surprised when I interviewed some of the folks from the tobacco growers associations. I wasn't surprised that they said we hardly hire anyone under 16, anyone under 18. But when I asked them, what would you think about proposals to ban kids under 16? They said they were open to it, even kids under 18. They're facing a lot of pressure from one cigarette company, which has really taken the lead on this. Philip Morris International has adopted a proposal far, far stricter than the U.S. Government regulations. Philip Morris International bars any of its growers from using workers under age 18, and it has barred 20 growers in the United States over the past year for using workers under age 18. R.J. Reynolds and Altria, the two other giant cigarette companies, have not adopted proposals nearly as strong. They're saying we hate illegal child labor. Everyone hates illegal child labor. And they say we think kids under 18 should not be doing hazardous work, but Reynolds and Altria don't see regular tobacco work in the fields where people are getting green tobacco sickness as hazardous.
What was Hilda Solis's response herself, the Secretary of Labor who pushed so hard for this?
I tried to interview Secretary Solis on this, but I didn't hear back. I think she was pretty courageous in pushing for this, but I think she doesn't want to be seen as criticizing the Obama administration right now.
How many children do you think are working in the fields in the states?
I think certainly several hundred. Some people say thousands. I think that might be a high number, but certainly several hundreds. And there are a lot of kids, 13, 14, 15, working. I interviewed a lot of 17, 18, 19-year-olds who said, I began at the age of 12. I interviewed, this 13-year-old Saray, whose picture's on the front page. I interviewed her 22-year-old sister. The 22-year-old sister said, I've been doing this since the age of 12. So it really is quite prevalent.
I want to, before we go, get to another piece you recently wrote about wage theft. Talk about what that is and where it's happening.
So when I was in North Carolina, it's funny, I was interviewing some folks, and some of the workers were saying, I suffered wage theft there. What is wage theft? Many employers violate minimum wage laws, or don't pay time and a half when workers, work more than 40 hours a week, or even when workers work 45, 50 hours a week and should be getting overtime. Some hours will magically disappear from their electronic time cards, and we'll just say they work 39 or 40 hours so they don't get overtime. Sometimes employers will illegally, steal tips that that waiters, waitresses, bartenders deserve, and it's illegal for managers to take tips. And all those different schemes to, deprive workers of their rightful wages, that's been called wage theft. And there's a growing push by advocates to get not just the U.S. Labor Department, but state labor departments to get much more aggressive about it.
We're going to have to leave it there, but I thank you very much. Stephen Greenhouse, author of Just 13 and Working Risky 12-Hour Shifts in the Tobacco Fields, his latest piece, also author of the book, The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for the American Worker. He's longtime labor and workplace reporter for the New York Times. We'll link to the articles on wage theft and children working in the tobacco fields of the United States at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burker, Nefel Saramate, Nermi Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Samakov, Hani Masood, Rabbi Karen Dina Guzder. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman. Our website is democracynow.org. Thanks so much for joining us.